We'll get going. All right, I want to thank you all for coming today. Today, I'm sending a letter to the Monroe County District Attorney, Sandra Dorley, seeking her to look into the crimes that were committed by a recent resident of the town of Brighton by the name of Anthony Bottom. Mr. Bottom is a triple cop killer who was convicted of homicide in the first degree in New York State for the killing of 2 New York City police officers. He additionally pled guilty for voluntary manslaughter when he participated about 5 months later in an attack on a San Francisco police station that resulted in the death of a 3rd officer. He had been incarcerated at Attica and had served, I believe, 44 years of a prison sentence, was eligible for parole. He was serving 25 years of life. I think first in the 1990s, been denied 11 times, got COVID in June, and then was granted parole on his 12th attempt. That parole attempt, I think it should be noted, was opposed by the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James. It was upon hearing it through the media that the gentleman had come to town, in fact, moved into the town that I live in, Brighton, that my curiosity was raised as exactly where he was placed and where he was residing. And unlike sex offenders and other people that sometimes get released into the community, there's not a release that goes out to the neighbors telling them where an individual of this type who has a violent history has been located. I didn't know where he was. But our party secretary, Larry Staub, simply asked the question, maybe you registered to vote. And it happened to be, it occurred on the same day that the Board of Elections had published the final list of voters for this year. And in their packet of data that they include is a separate database and material for all new registered voters. I opened that up, and sure enough, the man's information was included as a new voter. It was at that point I began to question whether he had the eligibility to vote as a felon, and came to determine that he did not, and that by the simple act of registering to vote, he committed several crimes. It says on the official New York State voter application, which you have copies of at the very top left of it, if you are on parole, you are not eligible to vote. At the bottom is an affidavit that you have to sign, attesting that you are qualified to register and vote, and he signed that. It is the filing of a false instrument. The affidavit indicates that it's a felony to do so, that you're potentially subject to penalties of up to $5,000 and 4 years in prison for falsifying that information. In addition, it requires you to state that you are a resident of the county, town, or village that you live in for a minimum of 30 days. Mr. Bottom had just been released out of prison, I believe, the day before he registered. He was released out of prison on October 7th. I believe that he registered to vote on the 8th, and he could have registered no later than the 9th, which was the cutoff and the deadline for people to register in New York State. So at least within 48 hours, he went to the Board of Elections and conducted an over-the-counter transaction to register to vote and found himself on the voter rolls. Individuals can be granted their voting rights in New York State through a number of different ways. He did not possess any of those credentials, or had not, for instance, served his entire sentence or come off parole. Those would have been automatic restorations. He was just on parole, so he didn't qualify under that circumstance. You can also apply for something known as a certificate of relief to get your voting rights restored. He didn't possess that, and I don't believe that he's eligible, because I think if you are a multiple felon, that you are not qualified to apply for that particular relief. The final one is that in 2018, Governor Cuomo issued an executive order permitting people who are felons and released into New York State to gain their citizenship right to vote through a conditional pardon. That executive order says that the governor is to be sent on a monthly basis a list of all of the felons that have been released from New York State prisons. Then the governor's office said that they would review it and make a determination of the individuals and whether or not they are qualified and that they would be granted this conditional pardon. Mr. Bottoms does not have that. In fact, it is an easy lookup on a publicly available database that the state has for people who are parolees. It's the parolee lookup, and in fact, it contains a field within it. Are you eligible to vote? Do you have voting rights? And in his case, it clearly says no, he doesn't. This is included in the information that we've handed out to you today. In addition to that is a screen capture of the database that I looked up. I don't have a copy of the physical registration. I believe that that needs to be foiled or it can be subpoenaed potentially by law enforcement. What I'm asking the district attorney to do is to investigate this and make a determination of the crimes that were committed. In doing so, I believe that there were multiple felonies and multiple crimes committed in him registering to vote. Election law 17-104.2 specifically says it's a felony to falsify a registration, and at the very least he's done that. This false instrument is another felony. He has violated his parole by committing these felonies, and I believe that he should be returned to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. This is something that I think is unfortunate it occurred, but it sort of indicates that, you know, in our willingness to make voter registration very easy, that an individual like this was able to register and get on the voter rolls. He would have, if he had the knowledge to do so, been able to ask for an absentee at the counter and actually cast a vote that day. So these are circumstances as we discovered them. I'm also going to call his parole officer, as it's listed on this parolee lookup, and inform him of what we've discovered. But this is an individual that I would hope the governor, if he was looking through the felons list, would take exception to and not grant a conditional pardon to provide him a right to vote. The Attorney General, as I said, opposed his release. I think that, you know, there's some questions to be asked about for the Department of Corrections and whether or not they're looking at just getting people out of the correctional facilities because of the pandemic. And as a result, they released an individual that has a very violent past and has committed one of the most heinous acts that our society views in the killing of multiple police officers. So, do you have any questions?
It started with a simple question someone asked, was he registered to vote?
Yeah.
Are you surprised at the trail that this took you down?
A little bit. I was surprised that he actually popped up on the list, to be honest with you. I thought it would be a dead end. And because of not only the timing of his release and when the deadline was, for him to think that one of his very first acts upon release from prison would be to go and register to vote is kind of extraordinary. I think that most people assume that felons can't vote, and I know that different states have different rules and laws pertaining to that, but he made no apparent effort to sit there and recognize that and went ahead and filed and got himself on the voter list. And it was shocking that somebody of this nature would be able to sit there and be a voter.
Is there a process by which the Board of Elections is supposed to vet people who register to determine if they are in fact eligible?
That's a better question for them. However, I'll tell you what I believe is the case in conversations. And I should be clear that it's my understanding that Mr. Bottom has been struck from the voter rolls after I made some inquiries. That I believe that the State Board of Elections, or the state, sends Board of Election a list of recently released felons for them to cross-reference. But it seems to be a trailing type of basket of information that is chasing down people after they've had this opportunity. And what's alarming, as I said, is that he could have cast a vote, an absentee, at the counter that day and gone ahead and voted. And while this database, I don't know if it's provided on a monthly basis or at the end of certain periods from the state, should be cross-referenced, and then individuals who are ineligible would be struck.
Sir, when we did this story earlier this week, so many comments that came in said, you know, welcome home, time served, glad to have you here. Really, seriously.
Yeah, I understand.
I guess in a couple sentences, can you illustrate the weight, the gravity of this situation? We live in a time when so many are concerned about fraudulent voting or people who aren't supposed to be voting. Just in a couple sentences so people can understand this is a pretty serious offense.
I think that that's exactly the case, is that there's a heightened awareness about the electoral system. There is a national conversation going on about election security. There was an announcement from the FBI and the Director of National Intelligence yesterday about compromised voter databases across the country being weaponized against particularly Democratic voters. These are very serious matters, and then to find out that there is laxness in the New York State system, that an individual who is not entitled to vote could find their way onto the database and be eligible to vote and could have cast a ballot, is deeply troubling, especially someone who I believe shouldn't have been. I'm with Letitia James, the Attorney General. I don't think that the man should have been released.
Do you think he's a danger to society?
I haven't heard from Sandra. No, I'm sending her the letter, and I'm going to call the parole officer. I have a copy of the letter. It's dated today. It'll be at the district attorney's office within the hour.
Do you think he's a danger to the community?
I don't know. I think that Mr. Bottom's behavior over a period of time that found himself in jail indicates that he has violent tendencies, and the fact that he was willing to consciously and with forethought attack police officers. This is an ambush assassination, an execution of 2 New York City police officers, and another attack on a police station that occurred in San Francisco indicates that he's just generally a dangerous guy. And subsequent to that, while incarcerated, he was found to have bomb-making materials and knives that were smuggled into him. I believe it was from the Black Liberation Army that he was affiliated with, who part of their tactics was to orchestrate and conduct prison breaks. So I think that they were trying to free their colleagues, and he was caught with these materials while in prison some years after he had been originally committed this crime. So I believe he was close to 20 years old when the initial crime took place. We're talking 5 years later. He's still prone to violent acts. So I think that people should be concerned, and I think that the residents of Brighton should be aware of where he lives. I would think that it should fall along lines of what occurs with regards to sexual predators, especially someone who has engaged in such horrific violence in the past.
What would you call on either the Board of Elections or the state elections for to change right now?
I think that the Board of Elections in the state are probably going to have to do a postmortem on this election because of all of the dramatic changes that have taken place. I think they learned a lot of lessons from the primary, but in this case, they need to come up with some quicker, better system to make sure that people who are ineligible because of their criminal past are not allowed to register to vote. And it can't be this delayed system where we'll send you a spreadsheet at some point and then you cross-reference it. It could have been after the fact. The man could have voted, and he wasn't entitled to do so. And it raises question, who else is on the database that isn't entitled to vote?
That was my next question.
What is his status now, and how quickly do you anticipate that changing now? If in fact he's committed these felonies, or may have, he could be in violation of his parole. Do you expect
Correct.
that to be revoked soon?
That's a question for the state and his parole officer, how they intend to handle that. My letter indicates to the district attorney that if it isn't a revocation of his parole, that he be prosecuted for these new crimes and potentially serve the sentence for those. I would think that that ultimately would amount to a revocation of his parole as well. But that's a question that's better for the state. I hope that it would happen quickly. Like I said, I don't believe that the man should have been released. The Attorney General doesn't believe that the man should have been released. He's a very violent individual who was issued a life sentence, and I think that given the nature of his crimes, he should have served that.
Did he enroll in any particular political party?
No, he registered as a blank. Unaffiliated. Any other questions? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. We've got, like I said, a copy of the letters in here, a copy of the database highlighted with his name where he appeared on it, the parolee lookup as well. And I think that's it. If you have any other information that you're seeking, and a copy of the voter registration form where it says, up towards the top, this is the information about being a parolee. Down here is a sample of the affidavit that you have to sign, an indication on the bottom line of the affidavit that you're subject to $5,000 penalty and potentially 4 years in prison for just that act. So I think that we're talking about multiple crimes here. Jenny, we're going to do it all over again? Okay.
Maybe others have reported this, or we haven't at the newspaper. Why is he in Brighton?
I don't know.
Relatives there?
I don't know. I don't believe, as far as I know, that he has any familial contacts. I don't know the individual where he resides. The address, which I am not putting in the press release, is in the letter to the district attorney, so that, and it's also on the database. It's a publicly available document. I'm not trying to dox the guy in that fashion. It's just that I wanted the district attorney to be able to identify exactly who we were speaking about. You know, why he finds himself in Brighton, I don't know. I've heard stories that the individual that he resides with is fairly vocal on social media about his distrust, dislike, and outward hatred of law enforcement and police officers. I haven't seen that material. Somebody showed me a picture of the individual and said that that's what you could find if you looked at him on Facebook. I don't even know the individual's name, but he is residing with somebody. I've seen the house, Center Entrance Colonial in Brighton. It's, you know, pretty nondescript, but anything else? All right. You can do whatever you want, Jenny.